Hey, welcome back to another Take 5. This is going to be the variables video. So if you watched the previous video, I talked a little bit about the fact that you can pull variables out and set them, as well as get them if you wanted to pass information around. Things like a Boolean here could be set as true or false. So I'm going to go over the information about what these all are. If you're completely unfamiliar with variables, you'll learn a little bit here, and then maybe in the future you can go in and work in C++ and you'll have a better understanding of how that works. But if you already know variables, go ahead and skip. You're probably not going to learn anything new. Maybe a little bit, but who knows. So anyway, so this is a Boolean. A Boolean is a true or false statement. It's a condition, and a lot of times what you're going to use a Boolean for is um, checking to see if this condition is met. So you're going to say it's almost like in most programming languages it's going to be an if statement. Well, but in here you're going to have something called a branch. The branch can be either true or false. That's a Boolean. Can't go any other direction. Actually, let's take this out, get rid of that, go here. So then we have a byte. This is like the most basic form of data. It's very small. A lot of times I don't use those very often, but you can use them for numbers and different values. But it's mostly a lot of times you're not going to be using that. You're going to probably be using an integer or a float or something like that. So we're going to come down to integers. Integers are always going to be real numbers, no decimals. They can be negative or positive, but they can't be decimals. And so then you've got floats, which can be decimals. So you can do a float that's 0.5. You could say 0.5, and that's okay, but you cannot put 0.5 in here because it won't let you. So it's an integer. Then we have names, which are kind of like strings. I don't know if you're familiar. If you're not familiar with strings, strings are basically text information that can be modified and checked through per character. So you can see how many characters there are. You can do a lot of stuff with strings. Names are just another type that's kind of like that, but it doesn't have all that utility for checking things as much as strings do. Like if you had a name and you wanted to see how many characters it had, or if you wanted to do other things, like cut it up and parse through it, you'd have to convert it to a string first and then do that information and then pass it back to a name if you wanted it to be a name. Then we have vectors. So vectors are basically three values. They're three float values, and it's going to be your x, y, and z in the world space or whatever space it is that you're talking about. That's a vector. And a lot of times, if you've even heard of vectors before, if you haven't heard of vectors, a lot of times you're going to use vectors for locations. You can also use them for scale. Those are the two main things that you'll use them for. We have rotators. Rotators are basically kind of like a vector, three float values, but it's specifically in rotation, so it's not quite the same. And those would be plugged into like a transform's rotation. A transform is the combination of all three of those: a scale, a location, and a rotation. That's what a transform is. So if you ever try to set a transform, you're going to have to make or have three things to create that. And then we have what are references. In C++, in um, the engines C++, in Unreal Engine, references are pointers to actors, to classes, to anything that's like that. So an actor reference is the same as an actor pointer. This would be, say you have an actor that has a variable called health, and you wanted to get that variable and you wanted to set it to fucking 50, but it was at 100. You could pull off of this actor if it had that variable, and you could, if it was already a reference, which you have, then you'd be able to set that value with it. Um, textures. Textures are another reference, but to a 2D texture file in the engine. So you could have these in your content browser, and you could put a texture in there if you wanted to. And a material is basically any shader, any magical shader that you make in the engine is going to be a material. Those are going to be any of the things. That's always what you use to put on 3D objects. And I chose these because they're pretty specific. I wanted you to see that textures and shaders are always going to be used a lot in the engine. You're not always going to have other things, but you're going to always be using materials and textures, so and actors. So anyway, that kind of concludes this video, and see you guys in the next one.